time comes, don't postpone it. When others doubt and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When your moment comes, grab hold and own it. Never let go, stand tall and hold tight. Overcoming obstacles is the objective in life. Doubters all the night, and onto them you shine bright. Cause inside your head, on goes the light. Ignite, fight for intuition upon the stars in the night that glisten. To you they listen, to be you instead of the wishing. When your time comes, don't postpone it. When others doubt and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When your moment comes, grab hold and own it. When your time comes, don't postpone it. When others doubt and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When your moment comes, grab hold and own it. Never let go, stand tall and hold tight. Overcoming obstacles is the objective in life. Never let go, stand tall and hold tight. Overcoming obstacles is the objective in life. Doubters all the night, and onto them you shine bright. Cause inside your head, on goes the light. Doubters all the night, and onto them you shine bright. Cause inside your head, on goes the light. Doubters all the night, and onto them you shine.
But America's pathology is her denial. It is why we have to have the conversation. It is why we can never agree on what's going on. And it is why we are so angry and why some of us are so afraid. It is because of the denial
that you cannot have unity without justice. You cannot have justice without the truth. You cannot tell the truth without courage, because the champions of God cannot win this war as cowards. Thank you.
Like we did back in the motherland. Brothers from the African Brotherhood, please.
Thank you so much. I want to always honor those who have given, and of course you, who have been my support through a war as it relates to this issue. I really do believe you have my back, and I will no doubt need you to have my back. So with that, I'd like to share with you just a piece. How many of you this is the first time you're hearing about post-traumatic slave syndrome? Okay. I know that a lot of information has been put out there about a lot of different things, but what I'm sharing is not really a new thing. It is something that we have known for a long time. That's why it resonates when I speak about it. It resonates in your heart. Before you understand any of the terms or the words, it resonates in your heart. When I speak to African Americans about this, it doesn't matter who they are or how old they are. It doesn't matter where they're from, what class level they have, whatever it is. They go, yes. Yes, that's true. Of course, when I talk to white people about it, they go, that's interesting. I don't know, that's interesting. But it is a legacy that we share. It is something that we know. It is something that's been strangely apparent, but made to be a secret. So what I basically did was I took a look at what was going on around me, and I began to question what I saw going on around me. So one of the things that I wanted to do is kind of start where I started. How did I get here, and why did I start looking at this in the first place? Where did it come from? Well, it started off with people asking about, diversity training. You know, it's, again, something that the world began to realize it needed for some reason, some diversity training. But that really came out of another experience, and it came out of people that were coming to the United States that weren't happy with the way they were being treated. The first thing I started to realize, you know, I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, and I always say that I believe that does deserve an applause. And part of what happened to me when I grew up in Los Angeles is I grew up, you know, really being exposed, not like New York, you know, because you all have Ellis Island. You know, you have people that came through Ellis Island. Well, not everybody came through Ellis Island. But you all had folks that came through Ellis Island, you know, and this was the place, you know, send us your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. But in LA, you know, you had folks, I was used to hearing lots of different languages and this sort of thing. And then I decided that I needed to move from Los Angeles. It was becoming too Hollywood, too material, and I didn't want my children to grow up in that. So I moved to Portland, which was a scary thing to do. Okay, because, you know, there was like, when I told people I was moving to Portland, they go, Joy, are there black people there? Are there black people in Portland? And I said, yeah, well, there are 3 or 4 of us, you know, we get together occasionally. So, you know, I moved to Portland, and it was a very unusual experience, and I'll tell you why. It was unusual because, first of all, stuff was happening there that I had never experienced in my life, and the first thing that I experienced was something called the possum incident. The possum incident. Now, this was a thing that I'd never seen before. I had never really seen too many possums before, you know. But what occurred was some police officers, 2 police officers, decided to take a dead possum and throw it into the doorway of a local black restaurant as a joke, right? And so they were reprimanded, slapped on the hand, and given, you know, vacations with pay. For that, but I was like, my God, that sounds like something coming out of the antebellum South. That's outrageous, right? And the next incident that occurred wasn't so innocuous. It involved an off-duty security guard, an African-American man. He entered a 7-Eleven. Y'all have 7-Elevens here, right? Entered a 7-Eleven, and, you know, he was just getting some snacks for the kids. He wasn't on, you know, he was just basically minding his own business, but there was a robbery in progress. Right? So the clerk, who was a young white male, was horrified, terrified, frozen, in fact. And he motioned to him to hit the button so that the police would come, and he actually grabbed the gentleman that was robbing the store, another young white male, and had him holding him by the neck. So the young clerk had called the police. In moments, 4 police cars converge. They see this real big black man holding on to this white man in the front of the store. So they assume that the black man is the one who robbed the store, so they attacked him. The white man ran off and was never seen again. So what they did was, during this time, it was popular to use what was known as a carotid hold, which apparently stops oxygen to the brain, knocks you out. This is what they did to Stevenson. And the law says that if after 4 minutes you don't come to naturally, that you have to apply mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And of course, in 4 minutes, Stevenson did not come to, and he died that day. And so there was a huge outcry from the community, largely the African-American community, that said, you know, was demanding justice. And so what happened was mandatory training for all police officers in Portland. That was part of the settlement. And I was among the first to be a part of that training. 750 Portland police officers. And after training 750 Portland police officers, I knew there was no one I couldn't train. They had guns. And so one of the things that happened during that time is I realized that, you know, first of all, they came to get me. They found me to do the training. You know, I thought, gee, they must really like me. But what happened was the black man that they had hired quit. He quit. It was too intense, you know, for him. So, you know, they called me in, and I'm thinking, all right, I thought they liked me, but it was just by default that I got called in. So I started to take a closer look, and I wanted to look more specifically at why it is we seem to have this conversation about race. Matter of fact, you know, a lot of people don't want to have the conversation about race. They go, I don't, let's move on. And so usually what happens to me is I start off workshops because I know that people enter this discussion at different levels. It's like they'll ask me to do a training, and I want you to talk to all the people. And you got people that are coming in at varying levels of the discussion. You have people that are coming in at the level of, is there still racism, you think? Aren't we doing better now? That's called Race Awareness 101, right? And I'm not mad at them, I just don't teach that. I used to teach Race Relations 101. I don't teach it anymore, there's no time. But they show up, and they're not bad, they need a prerequisite to be in my course. But they show up anyway, because after all, they're just not, how much more could I know than them? So they show up, and then you have the person that comes in and says, I want reparations, okay? And they're sitting next to each other. And I'm trying to keep everybody alive in that room, okay? So what I'm saying is it is a difficult discussion because everyone arrives at a different level of understanding of the conversation. Now, people of color enter the room at the 600 level. Having attended no school, they entered this conversation at the 600 level. And so the difficulty is balancing that out. So I always start with a test question, just to get a temperature, just a temperature guide on where everybody is. So I ask people if they understand what racism is. So I'm going to ask this audience, do you understand what racism is? Show of hands. Okay, See, this is the professor in me. I can't help it. So I'm going to ask you this question. Can white people be racist? Show of hands. Okay. Can black people be racist? Show of hands. Excellent. Show of hands. Okay, thank you. Now what I want you to do is, we're going to basically do a little research. I want you to consider two columns. The first column is called white racism. And I want you to name some of the things that are representative of white racism. In other words, how does white racism adversely impact the lives of black people? What are some of those ways that white racism adversely impacts? Housing, education, jobs, health care, profiling as it relates to justice, criminal justice, right? Okay, so if I were to continue to ask you, we would have a nice little list there, okay? And that's okay. Now we're going to move to the next category. How does black racism adversely impact the lives of white people? Let me get clear. I just want an answer as to how black racism adversely impacts the lives of white people as a group. Okay, here comes the problem, okay? Herein lies the problem. And I'll tell you the answer that I normally get, and I'm going to speak to that answer. They'll say fear. Now, I want you to stay there because at first I didn't want to own that. But it's true. But we need to find out why the fear is there. But the reason why we couldn't fill in the other blanks is because racism implies power. I might hate somebody, white, and say, I hate you, white, whitey, whitey. It's not going to change you being able to get that loan. It's not going to impact your ability to get the home of your choice. It implies not an ability to just dislike a group, but the power to impact them with that dislike. So that's what racism implies. And yet, there were a fair number of hands that went up in this audience. And there's a part of that, not understand we can be prejudiced. But to be racist means that you can take that prejudice and you can impact the lives of the whole group. And even when we look at fear, that doesn't happen to the whole group. So what I'm saying is that racism implies power, but the fact that that question ends up with different answers regardless of race says to me we need to continue to have this discussion so that we can understand how we arrived at where we are and how it is that we don't understand that. So then I started to take a look at behaviors. I had an opportunity, as you all know, many of you know, to go to South Africa. My sister eventually moved to South Africa. And during that time, I was wanting to really get a feel for normalcy around blackness. And that's what South Africa gave me, was a sense of normalcy. But I went in 1994 to South Africa at a point when blood was still running in the streets of Johannesburg as a result of the inauguration of Nelson Mandela. That was a deep time in the country. And I knew that when I was getting ready to leave, that I was probably going to encounter some negativity, okay? I figured there'd be a little negativity when I got to South Africa. You know, here I'm African American and Mandela's the new president, and folks might have been a little testy about that. So I was kind of prepared. Matter of fact, I'm gonna go on and say I had an attitude when I left. They always talk about how, we're always the ones that have the attitude, particularly black women. We got attitudes, we're aggressive, right? Intimidating, right? So I'm thinking to myself, I'm gonna go over there but I'm preparing for people to, kind of have an attitude. A little chip on my shoulder. My husband was not happy with me going at that time, but I was traveling with 8 other African American women, so when we arrived, it was a tense time, and I was waiting to have that experience of someone, just anyone, saying something ugly or nasty to me. Just waiting. Yes, just anybody. And then after a few weeks of nothing, literally nothing happening, I started to provoke the people. How are you going to go to South Africa for 6 weeks and come back without, something deep to talk about, So I would go to white South Africans and I'd ask them, tell me a little bit about that apartheid. That was to something, huh? Nelson Mandela, and they would go, it's true. It's been, joy. It's been an incredible experience, awful. The oppression of the blacks, the behavior of the whites. We're glad it's over now. Welcome to the new South Africa. So I'm going, okay, half a dozen people said that to me, right? I said, I know, I'm going to ask the black South Africans what happened, okay? So I went to the black South Africa. I said, tell me a little bit about, end apartheid, new black president. Tell me, how has that been? Joy, it's been incredible, awful, the oppression of the blacks, the behavior of the whites. We're glad it's over, though. Welcome to the new South Africa. And I'm thinking, isn't anybody upset? And I did not find, in any of the countries in the southern region of Africa, I did not find what I expected to find. The tension, the anger, the frustrations. I didn't get any of that. As a matter of fact, I got more of that in the Portland airport than I did the entire time I was in South Africa. So then I began to ask a question, so what is it that I'm looking at as a social scientist? How could it be these people so close to this time when oppression was right on their necks? How could it be that they did not exemplify what I thought would have been an outrage? And then I realized that what had happened to South Africa was rather unique. It was very unique. South Africa had to own it because the whole world watched. Other nations stood up and said, this isn't okay what you're doing. So South Africa had to own it. They had to say, I'm sorry to the world for apartheid. They had to say, I'm sorry to the entire world. And they did. They owned it. They said, we did it. We're sorry. Please come back and bring your money. Okay? So South Africa owned it. But America's pathology is her denial. It is why we have to have the conversation. It is why we can never agree on what's going on. And it is why we are so angry and why some of us are so afraid. It is because of the denial You know, my family's from Louisiana, and I remember, and this is the strangest thing, you know, because you know how you find out stuff about how to treat certain ailments. Now, I don't know why, did people just have more boils back in the day? Because I don't seem to see a lot of boils, you know, but somehow folks talked about what you do with a boil. And I knew that very young. Everybody knows what you got to do if there's a boil. What you got to do with it? You got to lance that boil. Everybody knows. I haven't had the opportunity very often to lance a boil, but I do know that's what you do with it. And what we have is a big old nasty, ugly boil. And we just go, well, I think if you put a little makeup on it, it's not really a boil. We start calling it something else. We won't lance the boil, but the healing can't happen until you lance the boil. And you can't heal what you don't see. And so what America has done is pretended that it wasn't there. And because they pretended and ignored it, it grew. It festered. And it is a monster today. It is why we have to continue to have this discussion, because we were never willing to look at it. So now what does the denial look like? That's a very important thing, because it's almost as though we are asleep. And one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to start looking at certain behaviors that I noticed that people would engage in. That to me was a real testimony as to our pathology around race. So those pathologies started to show up in a number of ways. One of the ways, and this is when you're in an environment of liberal people, liberal, open people that want to just really feel like we're all together, we are the world. And what they'll say to you, and this started to happen, and I know some of you in the audience have experienced this, where you are with very well-meaning, sincere white people who want you to know that they are not a racist, that they are open, and that they are liberal and accepting and inclusive. So they will say to you, I don't even notice race. I don't even notice it. And that's an interesting thing. Because I've noticed in my life that there's two groups of people that tend to tell the truth, and the truth is an important thing. I think the reason why Malik Yousef's spoken word poem on Hollywood Jerome, why it is so impactful, is because it's true. It's a true story. And I believe that truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtue. Without truthfulness, you cannot be healthy as a human being. So, are these people telling the truth when they say, I don't notice race? Well, there are two groups of people, if you ever want to test, that tend to tell the truth a lot. The first group are little children. The little ones, the little bitty ones. I would say 3, right around there. Because 3-year-olds have an opinion, you see. And your greatest fear is that they're going to meet up with some folks before you get in the room and give them their opinion on something. And they do. My daughter, and I hate to embarrass her in the room, but she entered a rather large room, not quite, maybe a third of this size. She got in there before me. And the people looked shocked out of their minds when I saw them. I couldn't imagine what she could have said. Well, that particular day, she decided she was going to let everyone know what kind of genitalia they had. And so she went about pointing to people and telling them what they had. And she probably, if she'd have seen a booger in her nose, she'd have pointed that out too. Okay? Because they'll tell you if you got a booger, Your friends won't tell you. Okay, they'll let you have that booger, but okay. The other group of people that tell the truth are our elders, the old folks. Because you see, you get to the point where you get old enough where you just really don't care what people think anymore. You're getting there, aren't you? I'm 47. I'm close. So you ask somebody, an older person, their opinion, and they'll tell you, you're stupid. That's your problem. You're stupid. So what would prompt then, anyone like that to tell an untruth. So we know that if we look at people, people are varying shades and hues and shapes and all that. So we know, in fact, that if I have a little towhead child here, now, the black people in the audience, you know what a towhead is? Okay, the white people in the audience, I checked with white people on the towhead. I got permission to use the term towhead because it seemed offensive growing up in South Central. I heard two ladies at the bus stop say, look at the little towhead. And I'm thinking, them's fighting words. I was here to back up, calling somebody's child a towhead. Well, it's the child that's blonde. The whole child is blonde. And it's the blonde that everybody wants to try to hope to get. That platinum blonde, the eyelashes are blonde, the eyebrows, the little hair on the arm, they look like a wisp of blondness. And it's striking. It's a very striking, when you see it, you're like, whoa. It's a very, very striking look. Now, you know who I'm talking about, right? You've seen these children. Imagine now next to that child, this towhead child, is a Japanese child. And next to the Japanese child is a Nigerian child. You think you might notice that there's a little difference there. Of course you notice it. These are God's choice of colors. How could you not? But what prompts white people to say they don't see race is the discomfort they feel with race. So rather than acknowledge that I see you, I'm going to erase you. And I wake up black every day. I look at myself, I'm okay with it. I'm okay with other people noticing I'm black. I'm not okay with being erased. It's not okay to erase me. But part of that has to do with what I call cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is when you have a certain amount of information or knowledge about a thing or yourself, and you are faced with conflicting behavior or information. It creates dissonance. Human beings cannot function with dissonance. They work to remove it. You have to remove the dissonance. Like I remember once at a workshop, I asked, I was talking about trying to explain what this meant to have cognitive dissonance. And I asked the audience, who in the audience smokes, but don't raise your hand. Because the woman started crying and stuff when I started telling her about the fact that anyone that smokes is insane. It requires a level of insanity to smoke in 2004. Now, we grew up with the little Winston cigarettes stuff with and the Camels and the Cools, which was designed to look cool and spell it both ways. So we were looking, you remember the Surgeon General warning? Yeah, barely can, because you had to take a magnifying glass to find it. And then when you did find it, it says, well, it might be possible that if, in fact, you did smoke, well, for some people, not many, but on some occasions, it could maybe a little bit hurt you, right? So, we didn't know, maybe. But now we live in 2004, and you can't even advertise for cigarettes anymore, but those that do, when they have a sign, it's a full third of the sign. The Surgeon General warning is you will die, die, die if you smoke. And if you happen to not catch that, then they'll show you on the American Cancer Association, a wheezing, ulcerating lung, And it just shows you this nasty, disgusting, sick lung, and then it'll say, don't smoke, right? So it's impossible in 2004 to not know the dangers of smoking, am I right? So now what we have to understand is what it takes to take the cigarette, light it, and get it to your mouth. And somewhere between lighting it and getting it to your mouth, you got to make that behavior okay, because it creates what? Cognitive dissonance. So you got to go, okay, no, I'm okay with this. This is going to be all right. I'm fine. No, I'm not going to die, not going to die, not going to die. And to do that, to engage in that kind of behavior, is a little nuts. Okay? So that's how far we will go as human beings. We have got to internalize a very different perspective of things. So when I began to look at this issue of race, it was much more convoluted than anyone would ever admit. So then I started to realize, and there were other, concepts of it. You all know, if you work and you're in any position, how many of you have be nice to the person of color day, some kind of thing? We get permission to be nice to people on, certain days, right? So then you'll try to plan for that day. And they'll say, well, I know, let's have an honoring diversity day. And they'll say, well, let's get Ming. Is Ming over there? Get Maria. She's a Mexican, isn't she? Yeah, get her. Yeah. Let's get White Horse. Get White Horse in here. And let's have a diversity committee. And let's plan something, why don't we? Let's plan a potluck, okay? And let's have a diversity theme. How about we have ethnic food? Maybe we could even have ethnic music. And, folks can come in ethnic garb, right? And now what you've done, I call that the fruit and festival approach to dealing with culture. And what you've done now is you've trivialized culture, right? You've trivialized it, because that's all you brought was a little music, a little food, that kind of thing. So that's the one. Then there are numbers of things that we do that trivialize culture, that make it a non-essential. All of these, you see, are to me the symptoms of our pathology around race. They're pathologies. And so when we begin to look at those, we have to understand where do they come from. So very briefly, so that we can understand where we're going, we have to understand how it is that we behave the way we do and why we behave the way we do. Now, far be it from me to start looking at stereotypes, because, we know that's a bad word, to stereotype. But I'm just curious with you. Have you noticed that certain groups of people behave differently? I don't want to make up stuff, but have you noticed? I'm going to give you permission to know this, that people do behave differently. African Americans, we behave differently. Okay, I'm in the race. I know what I'm talking about. Okay? I want you to know, you look at Latinos, different. Asians, ooh, we different. White people, ooh, different. Right? And the thing is that we try to figure out how that is, what's okay to notice when folks are acting different. We don't even know, because we're trying to be politically correct, right? Well, I know some of you are familiar with Dr. Edwin Nichols. How many people are familiar with Ed? All right. Dr. Edwin Nichols, this is his work, and as a matter of fact, I wrote a model based on his work, The Philosophical Aspects of Cultural Difference. And I'm only going to hit on one theme, because his work deals with axiology, epistemology, worldview. It's just a long process, but I'm going to only just zero in on axiology. He starts by explaining that we arrive at our primary value systems as groups of people, cultural groups or ethnic groups, if you will, based on one basic principle, and that's the principle of survival, which has lots of layers to it. But he talks about that fundamentally being the foundation of what a group knows and believes. And that the European axiology or primary value system is member or man to the object. Highest value lies in the object or in the acquisition of the object. And that object began many thousands of years ago in North Central Europe. And that object had a lot to do with what they needed to survive. What might that object be? Food. Fundamental. 5,000 to 8,000 years ago in North Central Europe, you needed food. And there wasn't much of it. And so part of what they learned and what they had to contend with was living in an environment where it was very harsh, very cold, very short planting seasons. They were considered supreme deer hunter when they were deer around, and they worshiped trees. These are the things we know about what is known as barbaric Europe during that period of time. Now I want to contrast that with the African and the Latino axiology, which is man to man, member to member. Highest value lies in the relationship between people. 5,000 to 8,000 years ago, tropical Africa, South America, how much time do you have to plant and grow your food? So what's the rush? We're not going to rush because we have plenty of time. We have plenty of time. Not only that, we have plenty of resources. If we run out of, roots, we'll fish. If we don't fish, we'll pick berries, but we'll get it done. And so we have a very different frame of reference and much of the focus, and of course it had more to do than with food, It had more to do than just looking about and seeing what those physical resources was, but it had to do with what were the human resources necessary to survive. And those human resources were a collective, hence tribe, hence the notion of village. And so as African people, the primary value system that we had was one of being together. Now this is perfectly illustrated in something as simple as greeting. Every cultural group has its own greeting. How do Asians greet traditionally? They bow, right? When you begin to look at a very different thing, you look at European greeting. And European greeting, again, it's a reflection of their primary value systems. And their greetings is perfunctory. It's a perfunctory greeting. Hello, how are you? How do you do? How do you do what? My white friends are going, okay, Joy, you know, it was just a greeting. That's all it was. Say hello. Because it's perfunctory. It's not, you know, it's just a formality. You gotta do it. Okay, now when Africans and Latinos greet, it's ceremonial, is it not? Think about it. We greet in ways that I don't think anybody else on the planet greets. I'm going to test it out today. Sir, could you stand up over here on the end? This brother here, stand up. Stand on up. Come on, stand on up. Okay. Let's see. Let's find somebody over here that, let me see. This brother here in the gray. Could you stand up, please, sir? Yes, you. And could you come over and greet this man? Could you meet him halfway and go in and greet him? Just want you to greet him. What I'm trying to say, as you know, it can get into a snap and slap and all kind of stuff goes on, right? And Latinos will pick you up, kiss you, or slap you in the face, all kind of stuff goes on, right? Because the greeting is to establish the what? The relationship. Highest value lies in the relationship, right? So these are things that become very important, and it's something that has transferred beyond one generation. It's gone over generations. It's not like someone taught you that, really. You know? When you're walking down the street and you're in the grocery store and you go, you know, whenever I used to have my white friends with me, they go, Joy, you know so many people. How you know? I don't know them people, but I'm going to greet them. You know, and greeting becomes something very important. And you think about it, even your children. You know, when you have children, can you come in the house and walk past Aunt Dolores? Not and live. Didn't you see Aunt Dolores? And then you got people you try to not acknowledge somebody that you know when you're out. Oh, wait a minute. You too good to speak? You too good? You know, all kinds of stuff can go awry with that, right? So greeting becomes very important. Now I want you to consider something else. I want you to consider what something like American chattel slavery did to the relationship. A people whose whole existence, fundamental to their survival, was their relationships. There was nothing that could have more devastated a group of people whose primary value system was the relationship than American chattel slavery. It destroyed and devastated relationships. One of the most horrific and vile things that could have occurred. So, I started to take a look at that impact on a group of people. It would have been different for any other group, but for African people, for American chattel slavery to exist, devastated the very foundation of the existence of African culture. And this is something we need to know. And yet, still we rise. It's phenomenal that we have. So I decided to take a look at this thing, this injury. I wanted to understand it because the first thing I started to realize is that it morphed into something that no one seemed to acknowledge. Because whenever I talk about slavery, and I'll tell you, you get reactions when you say slavery, don't you? People, the first thing they want to do, it's almost like the Million Man March. When the Million Man March happened, I'll never forget this. The first thing they did was found some black people to say it wasn't a good thing. Before it could be over with, they had people on television telling you how bad it was. And the first thing that happens when slavery comes out of the mouth of someone African or from African descent, well, that's all over now. That has nothing to do with, that's all over. First thing that happens, they want to shut you down immediately. And to me, that's the first indicator that I need to pay attention to it. So they said, well, you know, Joy, that was a long time ago. Slavery's over. Get over it. I wasn't even there. I didn't do it. I'm tired of being guilty about it. I didn't do it. I don't want to hear about it. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. And that's true. I wasn't there either. I didn't do it. But you've got to know that 246 years of official slavery guaranteed that the progeny of the South, the white progeny, would have wealth for generations to come. And that the black progeny of the slaves would incur a debt that we have yet to shake off. So it doesn't matter if either of us was there. If we were there or not, it doesn't matter, because the impact of that is present today. And that's the part that no one wants to talk about. That's the part that becomes uncomfortable to talk about. But we must talk about it if we are to lance the boil. So what I started to do is I started to try to understand it in the context of what I know people do. Now, a lot of people look at this, and it's not like, you know, there are many people that have discussed these things. But this is the first time we've ever discussed it on the level where we start telling the truth to the point where people start squirming. Because we got to tell the truth on this one. You know, how many of you are familiar with Dante's Inferno? Dante's Inferno is a story about a man who takes a trek through hell. And it was said that the hottest places in hell were reserved for those who were faced with a moral dilemma and decided to remain neutral. And what I understand about this issue is people desire to remain neutral. And we cannot any longer. Our children are dependent upon us telling the truth. So let's tell the truth about slavery. Because like most people, we look at it as Africans, and we have, and descendants of Africans, we have strange feelings about it. Yet there's something intrinsic in who we are that knows that it's true. So let's take a look at some of the things that we need to look at. We need to look at our history books. We need to first look at what most of you are familiar with out there, because everything speaks to this notion of race, and that we have had problems with it for a long time. So let's go to the Bible. And let's go to Numbers 12, if you want to know where it is. It's not obscure. In Numbers 12, verse 1, it says, "And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married." Moses had a black wife, and Miriam and Aaron didn't like it. It goes on to say that they kindled the wrath of God. God became angry and smite Miriam with leprosy because she didn't like Moses' black wife. And as much as I hear all the rhetoric about the problems that are existing within the African American community and anti-Semitism and all of that, nobody mentioned that Moses' wife was black, that we're probably cousins. How did we miss that one? I don't think Charlton Heston had a black wife when he did Moses. I looked. And if you're going to stay true to the story, it's not like it's obscure. Now, the only time I've ever seen it done truthfully, and I waited to see, was a full-length cartoon. And it wasn't Disney. Disney, well, that was too controversial, I guess, even in cartoon form. Wouldn't do it. It was a full-length cartoon. And indeed, I waited. And Moses' wife was black. Broad nose, thick hair. Even Moses was a little brown. Okay? Just a little brown. Of course, when he received the full revelation, he was completely white. Completely white. But I had to give him some props. Give him some props, Moses' wife. So what we understand is, in a biblical way, we have been struggling with this issue. We've been struggling with it. And we won't tell the truth about it. Then we understand that, at least for me and my family, when you really, I come from a family of people that, my father really taught us to express what we believe and what we felt, albeit respectfully, but say it in a way that, people understand that that's what you really feel. So we tend to speak kind of all at once, okay? And you got to jump in there in my family. And you just got to get above the highest octave, whatever that is. And so when we get intense and we want to prove a point, we say to people, I know I'm right on this because I read it in a book, which presumably means it's what? It must be the truth. It's written in a book. And then if you can't find it in a book, then of course you have to up the ante, and then you move it up to, it's a scientific fact, what I'm saying to you here. Of course I'm right, it's scientific fact. So what I did was I went in fact to the literature and I went to science, those two areas that we tend to worship in this country. And so when I looked at one of those heroes that we've made our literary heroes is William Shakespeare. What did he have to say? Now, William Shakespeare was a reflection of his day. He talked about, in his plays, he talked about what he believed and what he saw. And one of the things that he did was he dealt with the idea of miscegenation. That's race mixing, right? Which is taboo. And I'm going to talk about why it's a taboo. Shakespeare often dealt with racial mixing, the miscegenation issue. In his first tragedy, Titus Andromachus, the black Moor Aaron had an illegitimate child by his white lover, Tamora. When the nurse first saw the child, she exclaimed, "A devil, a joyless, dismal, black and sorrowful issue as loathsome as a toad among the fairest breeders of our time." In Love's Labor Lost, the king declares, "Black is the badge of hell, the hue of the dungeons, and the suit of night." And Macbeth curses his servant, saying, "The devil damn thee black." And of course, all of his tragedies, the worst of all was, of course, Othello, where predictably it ends in the destruction of both Desdemona and Othello, and it's packed full of negative imagery around blackness. So we need to begin to understand the etiology of how it is we've come to look at this blackness so negatively. Why is that so? These are God's choice of colors. How could it be? What does it mean? What does it create when you're dealing with someone that's not black? When you're dealing with someone, for example, that's white? So I went again to some literature and I wanted to see, is this happening on a pervasive level? I want you to know something, that whenever people oppress another group of people, it doesn't matter who they are, women, people of color, it doesn't matter who the group is, they have to remove the cognitive dissonance. Because if you're a good person, you render yourself a good person. You say that I'm a fair person, I'm a moral person, I'm a spiritual person. I don't do things that are bad to people, like, hello, enslave them. I don't do things that are mean and horrific. So in order for me to feel good about myself, I have to remove the cognitive dissonance, and I do this by, number one, justifying my behavior to ease the mind. And I justify that behavior by relabeling the people. I give them another label, then I can feel okay about who I am. I want to read this, and I want you to know that this was taken out of a 4th grade textbook in Oregon. And it was taken off the shelf by a gentleman by the name of Daryl Milner, who's the head of Black Studies. Daryl Milner took this off of the shelf But for years, in the late 80s, 85, he took it off the shelf. But nobody knew that there was anything wrong with it. I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it, and we're going to see if you're going to catch it. Because he read it over and over again to the then social studies teachers who didn't notice there was anything wrong with it. And it remained for many years. It starts off by saying environment, and then in big letters, John Muir. Have you ever visited Mount Rainier, the Grand Canyon, the Petrified Forest, or Yosemite? These places are all national parks today, in part because of the work of one man, John Muir. In the 1800s, millions of people began living in parts of the United States where no one had ever lived before. To make their livings, people chopped down forests to have lumber for building and to clear land for farming. People put dams across rivers, they built roads, bridges, and railroads, and they dug mines. He read it over and over again. In the 1800s, millions of people began living in the parts of the United States where no one had ever lived before. Now, either Native Americans are not human beings, or they're simply not worthy of mention. Are you following me? They read it over and over again. Nothing's missing here. But what happened to the Native American child sitting in that classroom? And what are the possibilities that they would confront that inaccuracy? Again, the attempt to erase. But why would you want to erase this group of people? What dissonance does it produce for you? What have you done to them? I want you to stay with me there. I simply look at this as something that's trivial. I eliminate it, I erase it, because it creates what for me? Cognitive dissonance. We look at even the terms that are used in history, who the heroes are. We look at what they did. They would go in and slaughter people, but those were called victories. And when the Native Americans fought back, it was called massacres. So we have to understand the words that we use have a lot to do with how we perceive things, because words hurt, don't they? There's something about words that stay with us. And I want you to remember that as we move through. So then I had to take a look at these things, and I'm going, so Joy, what exactly are we talking about? So I went to school. I went and got first of all, I want to say I have a lot of degrees, but I don't particularly like school, okay? I ended up staying in there because I had difficulties with a lot of stuff. So I ended up with a lot of degrees because I was confused about a lot of stuff. But when I was going for my master's degree in clinical psychology, I was pursuing a side degree or a PhD in psychology. And I just figured out I didn't like psychology. I didn't like what it did to people. I didn't like the labels that it used, because you know, psychology was born out of, I think, and psychiatry actually, the need to get paid. Come on. There's a book called the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, right? And if you bill insurance, you better have a code. So if you don't have a sickness, I'm going to give you one, because that's the only way I'm going to get paid. Now, surely there's something called mental illness. I wouldn't trivialize that. That's true. We do have a lot of mental illness. But I had a real problem with how people, quote, treated it. And one of the things that came up that people, my teachers, would talk about, there was a couple of things, but one of the things they would talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's a long time ago, so I looked at post-traumatic stress disorder. I said, well, now, that seems pretty interesting. And the first thing I wanted to know about post-traumatic stress disorder is, well, who gets it? And what is this thing? Actually, post-traumatic stress disorder was born out of shell shock. How many of you are familiar with that term, shell shock? And shell shock is one of those things that happened, for lack of a better word, they didn't know what to call it, for veterans, people who were in war, that would come back and they'd have these behaviors because they were, looking at people getting killed and this sort of thing. So I wanted to see who they listed. And these are the folks they listed that apparently had traumas as a result of some major stressor. Identify groups. This is in that book called the DSM. Victims of rape, war veterans, heart attack victims. I'm going to talk about that one for a minute. Victims of natural disaster and victims of severe accidents. That's who's listed. And heart attack victims are often listed because when a person has a heart attack, their greatest fear is that the next one's going to do what? Right. So it creates a certain level of a stress. So they end up with... So I said, well, where are the slaves? Seems to me slaves ought to be on here. And when I brought that to my professors, they said, oh, no, that was too long ago. That couldn't work. I'm going, well, it just seems to me they ought to be there, right? So, I had a lot of problems in my program, For example, one of the things I asked them is, we studied Freud, Rogers, and everybody, all the theorists, all of whom were men, all of whom were white men, and most of their patients were white women, still are. So I started to look at that behavior, and I was questioning that. I said, now tell me this. I'm just curious, and I brought this up at one of those meetings where they had the faculty and the graduate students, and they wanted to have inclusion. So they wanted to help us get to a feeling of everyone being included. So I said, I have a question for you. I said, I want you to consider every single person that has been healed as a result of, psychotherapy and psychodynamic therapy and whatever theory you want, all of them, Adler, everybody, bring them in. I want you to consider everyone that says, I did this and then I was healed. And I want you to compare that number to the number of people on the planet that said, I had faith. I had a God and I knew it wasn't me. How many of them believe that that is what healed them? And there was a little hush, okay? And they were going, well, this, I can't measure that. I go, oh yeah, we can. We can measure that. Ask people, right? So I'm in the room with the people. I said, is it not a fact that there are more people that have been healed as a result of what they believe in their heart and their faith and prayer than what all of these combined theorists came up with? That's why I knew I had to go. I wasn't going to make it there very long because they didn't want to deal with that truth. They didn't want to deal with that truth. Instead, you get in and they erase spirituality. Or they try to figure out how to package it and sell it. So then I asked this question about slaves. And they said it was too long ago. I said, well, why was it too long ago to diagnose? Well, because post-traumatic stress disorder only occurs over a period of time for a person that has experienced a trauma. I said, okay. So let's look at what happens. What are the kinds of things that people begin to behave like? This is what they would behave like if you have post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, you all know in New York, because of 9/11. When 9/11 happened, the entire country was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. But not everybody had post-traumatic stress disorder based on those buildings coming down. And it was a tragic event, but not everybody was traumatized by that. Matter of fact, I would submit to you that there were folks traumatized long before that. But there was something that happened when people saw those objects crumble. And what those objects represented to America, what they were a symbol of, the World Trade Center. It wasn't just the lives that were lost. It was the symbol of what it meant. And that was wrapped in the notion of power and control and stability, all of those things, greatness. So many people experience post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people can't get on airplanes today, and they were nowhere near New York. So I understand that people experience that. Now let's see how they behave when they have been traumatized. Intense psychological stress and distress at the exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the trauma or the traumatic event. So I would imagine that if people, were walking around and they were around tall buildings or they saw airplanes going over, that this would trigger, are you following me? Physiological reactivity to exposure to the external or internal event. So again, you'd have a physical response. Marked diminished interest or of participation in significant activities. This is a person no longer wants to do things. feeling of detachment or estrangement from others, restricted range of affect, unable to have loving feelings, a sense of foreshortened future, does not expect to have a career, marriage, children, or a normal lifespan, difficulty falling or staying asleep, irritability or outbursts of anger, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response. These are the behaviors of an individual that's been traumatized. These are the symptoms that they are living with. So they go to a doctor and they try to get us some medications. And if you're poor and don't know about that, you self-medicate. So this is what people do. And I'm going, okay, that makes sense to me. Now let's see. Let's look at the diagnostic features of post-traumatic stress disorder. These are what the most common trauma involved. And so once again, I said to my professors, but are you saying that slaves didn't have this? They said, Joy, that was too long ago. I said, okay. So what I started to do, like I asked my audiences to do, let's take a look at what these features are, and you and I will determine if maybe some of the slaves had it. Because, you know, they constantly tell us how happy we were during slavery. Even if you pick up any textbook in our schools, they'll show you happy slaves. Won't they? Nice little cabin, folks playing the banjo, happily eating pig entrails and watermelon, grateful for the master. Isn't that what they show us? Because we need to see those pictures, because we need to remove the what? The cognitive dissonance. We need to believe that the way we treated you was just like, and you was happy about it too. That's why those pictures are there. So I'm gonna give them that. All three of the slaves that were happy, and even the few that are still happy today. I'm gonna give you them. So now, let's look at this and let's determine if in fact, and the thing about the DSM, because you know you need to be able to get the money, right? So if a person is diagnosed with dysthymia, which is, you know, kind of recurring depression, ongoing depression, chronic depression, you have, you know, you don't have to have all the features of depression, for example, to get that diagnosis. You only need a couple of them. Okay, maybe one you can get, you know. So I want you to bear in mind that you didn't have to have all of these to get the diagnosis. But I want you to tell me if you think outside of the three happy slaves, I want you to tell me if you think the rest of them might have experienced these. A serious threat to or a harm to one's life or physical integrity. They get that one. Threat or harm to one's children, spouse, or close relatives. Sudden destruction of one's home or community. Seeing another person injured, killed as a result of an accident or physical violence. Learning about a serious threat to a close friend, a relative kidnapped, tortured, or killed. Stressor is experienced with intense fear, terror, and helplessness. Disorder is considered to be more serious and will last longer when the stressor is of human design. That's 7 out of 7. You think they might have had it? Of course they did. And do you remember how I described exaggerated startle response, difficulty staying or falling asleep, outbursts of anger, exaggerated emotions is what we're talking about. A person that doesn't see a future for themselves. I want you to consider that person. And so everyone would agree that slaves had it. Did they treat the slaves when they had it? So during that time, did the master say, I notice you've been stressed lately. I'm thinking you need a little help. You think? No, they didn't get any help. And did they experience one trauma? Now understand that there were people that weren't there in New York when it occurred. They were somewhere in New Zealand watching it on TV And they need to go to therapy behind it. So how is it we think that these people who lived a lifetime of trauma, lifetime, that they did not suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder? So I think most would agree it doesn't take, it's not even plausible to assume they didn't have it. That's plain foolish. That's called, it has face validity. So now we know they had it. And how long did slavery last? Okay, they had it over a duration, and then when mother had it, because that was mom and dad and aunt and everybody else who had it, raising Johnny, yes? So Johnny was dealing with someone that had difficulty staying or falling asleep, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future and doom. That was mama raising Johnny. And did Johnny get some traumas? And did little Mary get some traumas? And that's what they named us. So what I'm trying to say and what I began to do is not far-fetched. It's not some rugged emotionalism that I'm talking about here. This makes sense. It simply makes sense. So now that we know it makes sense that the slaves had it, they say, but Joy, that was so long ago. Y'all been free. Y'all free now, aren't you? You're free. And what did freedom give us? So you have now all of these hundreds of years of slavery, hundreds of years of it. And then people will say, well, there's always been slavery, Joy. There's always been slavery. Matter of fact, you people enslaved. And there is, in fact, truth to that. People did have slaves, but not the kind of slavery that Americans had. Romans had slaves. I mean, almost every society had slaves, but not like America had slaves. Because American slavery, most people enslaved people of their own race, first of all. That's what happens. And that person was not considered less than human. Africans were considered less than human. They were considered de facto slaves because of the Aristotelian notion of a natural slave. The color of the skin raises a presumption of slavery, said Aristotle, which deems them fitted to slavery permanently. They will never, ever reach the bastions of normalcy as it relates to whiteness. They will never be fully human. 3/5. So what we have to understand is that the nature of American chattel slavery was unlike anything anywhere else, nor did anything else share in its duration. So we're talking about a real severe process. Now, how many of you are familiar with the Ma'afa? The Ma'afa is a Kiswahili word that means the great suffering. You have a wonderful celebration of the acknowledgement of those on whose shoulders we stand, right here in your fair state. The St. Paul Community Baptist Church does a Ma'afa commemoration, and many others are doing it around the country now. And so what was the state of things during the Ma'afa? And that's the middle passage of slavery. Malik Youssef has a poem he says, and he talks about how little kids try to describe the fact that we came over on a cruise. But on a cruise, you're not usually abused. So this was a real different kind of a cruise. So let's take a look at that. And there's a lot of argument around how many people died during the middle passage of slavery. The lowest figure documented with some level of accuracy is 9 million. That's the lowest one. And we don't tie a yellow ribbon on for them. We don't ever acknowledge them. When do you remember us acknowledging them? When? And they punished Spielberg when he tried to acknowledge it. So we need to understand that these were millions of men, women, and children that perished in the trip over. Millions. And we don't ever acknowledge them. Doesn't that seem odd to you? How could that be? We've not forgotten. We have not forgotten. But they have been erased mysteriously from the pages of history. They've been erased. And why do we erase people? To remove the what? The dissonance. Even during the filming of Amistad, the actors wept, not on cue because they couldn't help but weep. It got so they couldn't have white people chaining them. They had to bring in black people to do it because it was that unbearable. Spielberg knew. Why did he know? Because he didn't forget his Holocaust. He didn't. And you shouldn't. So what I began to realize is that this has morphed into a kind of lie that the annals of history, past or future, will never have seen. This is the biggest lie that has ever been told, as though it never occurred. How could we forget them? Millions. And what was the trip like? Well, you know that some of the cargo ships, they wanted to pack as many in as they could. They overbooked, if you will. And they did that for one reason. They did it because they needed to ensure that a certain number would go to market. It's like any other cargo you have. Some of it will spoil and perish. And so they had to figure that out. So they packed in, tons of people, rows of people, 18 inches apart, 18 inches surrounding them for sometimes months. 18 inches. Stay with me here. Stench-filled, rodents, feces. It's where they ate. It's where they slept. It's where they wept. It's where they urinated. It's where they defecated. It's where they vomited. And it's where they gave birth and where they died. In 18 inches of space. How could we forget that? But y'all are free. So when we begin to look at this, it's not a pretty picture, and I understand why people run from it. But my children need to know who paid for them. In my book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing, many people have said, Joy, where's the book? Where's the book? And one of the things that happened to me when I started to write the book is there was so much I needed to fold in those pages. So much. And the second process is, how do I market it? How do I sell it? How do I do all those things? And who's going to have the final call on what's going to go in it? That would be me. So I'm not getting ready to sell it to a publishing house and be raped with my injury. Can't happen. It just can't happen. So I'm self-publishing the book for those reasons.
Now is my time to shine. When your time comes, don't postpone it. When others doubt and out, you don't condone it. Truth be told, yourself is your toughest opponent. When your moment comes, grab hold and own it. Never let go, stand tall and hold tight. Overcoming obstacles is the objective in life. Doubters all the night, and onto them you shine bright. Cause inside your head, on goes the light. Ignite, play the intuition upon the stars in the night that glisten. To you they listen, to be you instead of the wishing. When your time comes, don't postpone it. When others